ladies and gentlemen, what a huge honor it really is to be standing here with you today. But also, for me, what a wonderful pleasure it is to be with so many kind friends, too. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming, for me and for Adele. It goes without saying, but I think it is still worth saying, that I value the friendships that I have with many people in this room today, more than anything in the world. And yet again, being here with so many wonderfully dedicated and talented people, I am struck by the fact that the world of traditional and classical building is now a powerful and a confident movement of a breadth and a depth that we could have only dreamt of when I first started working 25 years ago. And with so many of the solutions to the pressing problems of the world at our fingertips. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves of this fact from time to time. This is a movement with so many threads in the warp and weft of its cloth, a richly woven tapestry of mutual and shared interest, which wraps in its cloak those who love the environment, landscape, nature, those who care about where food comes from, how it's grown and produced, those who are concerned with urbanism, population growth, the exponential explosion of cities in deruralizing populations around the world, those who are fascinated by nurturing sustainable communities, economies, improving transport systems or education or means of social and economic exchange, those, like Adele, whose interests are the conservation of old buildings, or understanding environmentally friendly building systems, or natural and timeless building materials, and those of us who are also intrigued, a little bit like me, by the lessons that history has to teach us in design, which is something I'll return to later. We are a very broad family, and at our heart for me is a powerful word that was coined or used by the former Prince of Wales in the title of his book, Harmony. We are all, in our own ways, I think, trying to find ways in which to live in, with, and for principles of harmony, both natural and humane in this world. To receive an award like this, standing on the shoulders of so many people whom I admire very deeply, it is, of course, somewhat overwhelming. And when I first heard from Stefanos at the end of last year, it is true to say that I was a little short of speechless. And for those that know me well, that is a very unusual state for me to be in. Of course, I recovered soon enough, and I wanted to start by really paying tribute to Richard Driehaus, as we've heard so many times this morning, who had such an extraordinary foresight about this movement to which we all belong. But he also had the vigor and the energy and, frankly, the good humor to help bring it all to fruition. Now, I was lucky enough to spend proper time with Richard only once. Leo will remember it well. It was a tour of Poundbury on the evening before Queen Elizabeth and the former Duke of Edinburgh were coming to Prince Charles's, the then Prince Charles's, and Leon's extraordinary town to open the Queen Mother Square and unveil the great new bronze statue of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, at the heart of Leon's settlement. I met Leon and Richard at the Duchy of Cornwall office, and we started with a walk around the various more recent parts of the town, which I have designed with Leon and with my great friend George Somero-Smith, who's here today. Richard was, I think it's fair to say, deeply impressed with the quality of everything that he was seeing. But it appeared to me that he had quite a specific metric to measure the success of a new place, because he kept on saying, "Oh my goodness, this feels like a town of 5,000 people." And then after another street or two, it was like 10,000 people. And we approached the square, and he said, "No, hold that. This feels like a town of 25,000 people at least." And when we arrived in Leon's great main civic space with the Royal Pavilion that Leon and I had designed, in front of him. He said, "Scrap all of that. This is truly a city with a population of at least 50,000 people." So we now got a measure of how Richard measured the success of places. It's truly wonderful. And then he realized that Lyon's tall tower, which is at the center of every major vista in Poundbury, which I had designed the building, was crowned by nothing less than a rendition of the Heragic monument of Lysicrates, at which point it became a little bit too much for him, and he just had to sit down and take it all in. And then, meanwhile, I was quietly staring at the fact that the entire tower had had all of its scaffolding removed purely for this occasion, which went back up the day after the Queen had visited. And this was really quite an extreme version, even by the usual standards of things that happen to get ready for royal visits in Poundbury. But anyway, I cannot think of a more appropriate place on that summer evening to have spent time with Richard. And I know that it goes without saying that everyone here misses him and his infectious laugh and enthusiasm more than I can know. And his name and his memory quite clearly, truly live on, as we can see here in the room. I'm going to get some water. I'm struck that we are living in a moment when the challenges of the world can seem almost insurmountable in their complexity, in their sense of contradiction, and in their urgency. It's both powerful and very good that in this room, therefore, are so many young students up on the balcony from Notre Dame. And I wanted to spend a moment, if I could, trying to think about the world from your perspective at the start of what I am sure will be wonderful, productive, and engaging careers. Now, only a week or two ago, I was talking to my very old friend, Marianne Cassato, alumni of Notre Dame, my office desk neighbor for almost 5 years in New York when we both worked for Anne Fairfax and Richard Salmons, all of those years ago. I was her co-author of Get Your House Right, which is the book which really got us both started on this great adventure, I think, Marianne. Marianne, the creator of the brilliant Katrina Cottage and everything that has flowed from it, and of course now a lecturer and a tutor back at your wonderful university. Now, she knew that we'd have absolutely no time at all over this weekend in Chicago to really catch up. So we booked a call a couple of weeks ago and had a really good, long, old chat. It was the first time we'd spoken in a long time. Of course, it felt like we'd just spoken a few days before. She's that sort of friend. And one thing struck me when she was telling me about you, her students. They are just so sorted, Ben, she said. They really are. So thoughtful, so full of understanding of the issues of the world. I look back at myself at that age and, well, really, they're just on a whole different level. Now, it's probably true that Marianne is just being modest as usual, but for those in the room to whom this applies, you should feel proud of yourselves and also very well equipped to make the difference in the world that your wonderful university is training you to do. But perhaps I could also give a tiny bit of advice at the opposite end of 30 years since I was at university in Edinburgh, in Scotland, in the early 1990s. It's strange to think then that there were no mobile phones, no internet, no social media, no Sky News. Word processors were just getting going. We were about to tip into the digital world, but it was still largely analog. We actually used books in libraries and looked up historic newspapers on microfiche. And when we left university, we gave all of our friends our parents' addresses and telephone numbers because none of us had mobile phones or emails. Our climate emergency was the hole in the ozone layer and acid rain, both of which have now largely been solved. And it felt at that moment, with the collapse of communism and the bringing down of the Berlin Wall, that the world was entering an era of relative peace. And it does feel to me today that we are in a harsher place, trapped in a cycle of despairing 24-hour news and in the angry echo chamber of social media, and of a global connectivity which is simultaneously amazing, but equally unsettling, putting as it does the problems of every corner of the globe into our own private orbit every minute of the day. One solution I have to face all of this myself is to try to really look after the problems that are in my direct control, and not to worry too much about the things that aren't. And of course, stay informed, have concern, but that's not quite the same thing as being worried or fearful. You will be amazed at how much you can do if you think about the things you can actually do something about, whether it is just doing a great job of designing the building that you're being asked to design, or planning the streets of a settlement that you might be looking at, or in the interior design side of my practice, to be thinking about simple questions like, will this piece of fabric last? Will this design stand the test of time? Where was this piece of furniture made? By whom? Does it have a place in a sustainable production chain? And the curious thing is that if we add up the collective efforts of our huge family of friends and colleagues around the world who are on a daily basis addressing such questions in their lives and their work, well, we suddenly realize that we are part of a really powerful thing, and we are not alone. It is beyond any one of us individually to solve the overwhelming problems and issues of contemporary life, the relentless expansion of suburban sprawl, cheap plastic house construction, industrial, chemical, hyperscaled food production. But trust me, collectively, things are moving, and I am quite sure that the world is changing for the better, just as much as we might be told by the media that it is changing for the worse. And this collective change is made up of hundreds and thousands, millions of people just like you who are seeking to make a difference in their own small way. The other great lesson that I have learned is that any problem we are faced with in the world, any problem at all, has generally been looked at and solved pretty well before, and more often than not has been solved beautifully and elegantly, sometimes by people who had more time to think about it than we might do today. Now, this is certainly the case in architecture, where I increasingly realize that the lessons of history are the ones that I turn to again and again when I'm trying to answer the questions of which type of building might feel right here. What materials should we use there? How should we resolve that weathering detail? How wide should we make this street, or how tall the buildings on either side of it? Will this square feel too large or too small, or just right to be a beautiful place to live? In borrowing from these lessons, at no time have I ever felt constrained in creativity or in original design. If you work in a traditional language of architecture, you are as constrained in creativity as an author setting out to write a novel using established language and grammar, or a composer thinking about writing a piece of music based on the combinations of the same 13 notes as every other piece of classical music ever written. The possibilities are limitless, but in my view, the chances of success are a little more certain than if we try to start entirely without learning from precedent. I'll also happily admit that I am a cheerful optimist in the face of all of our challenges. I really am a believer that everything tends to turn out okay in the end. And that is also one of the great lessons of history for me. If we look at the history of this great country, America, which I love so much, there are plenty of moments when it must have seemed to her citizens that things could never recover. And yet they do. They did. They will again. Life is cyclical. We are inventive. We are brilliant at solving problems, whilst also, I'm afraid, at creating new and as yet unknown ones. Of course, we live in a particular moment where this love of history is a real and complex, messy, contradictory, living thing that has so much to teach us today, does feel under threat. A sense of threat that I'm sure many people in this room feel keenly. I recently found myself reading again about that strange and terrible decade from 1966 to 76 when Chairman Mao, needing to give new energy to the communist revolution in China, promulgated his so-called Cultural Revolution. As you may know, Mao pronounced the destruction of what he called the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. His chosen army of destruction was the Chinese youth, often young people, aged as little as 11 or 12 or 13 years old. Parents, teachers, university lecturers, former businessmen, all were under threat of sudden denouncement. Libraries were burned, old buildings destroyed, museums desecrated, ancient theatres closed, temples and religion banned. The madness was cyclical and all-engorging. Perhaps 1 million or more people were put to death in those 10 years for things that they believed. You young people, Mao wrote in his Red Book to his youth army, you young people, you are full of vigor and vitality and are in the bloom of life like the sun at 8 or 9 in the morning. The world belongs to you. But it was, of course, a twisted world in which they were being brainwashed to destroy their inheritance. So I wanted to end, if I may, by saying that I really do increasingly revere the four olds: old customs, culture, habits, and ideas. And I think it's important that we always stand up for them. This is not to say that they mustn't be challenged, and it's not to say that we should live in the past. Actually, as Leon said, that is, after all, the one thing we can never actually do. We can only live right now, here, in the present. Of course, history has some terrible legacies, but it has great legacy too. Our work is to distinguish between the two. We must never become stultified or dull or irrelevant because we're hiding from life as it is, or indeed as it could be. But those four olds teach us a huge amount of what we need to equip us on this long, happy journey of life. Now, in all of this, I can't help but feel that I think that the students of Notre Dame are placed in an almost unique position, because the vigor and vitality of your sunrise is underscored by something just as powerful, which is the knowledge entailed in the hours lived until sunset the day before. This is a very rare quality to be taught today, and you have it in great part owing to the dedication of people like Richard and the many others like him, including so many of the faculty of Notre Dame, and of course the ideas and the work of the many previous laureates of this award. One of the nicest things about being on this podium is knowing that I will, I hope, over the years, be spending a bit more time with the university, helping to steer some of your lives and careers, and hopefully coming back many times to this wonderful city of Chicago, where we will gather to celebrate many laureates in years to come. Richard's Prize was founded 21 years ago. I cannot help but cast my mind ahead to think how things will be in March 2044, 21 years from now, or March 2065, 21 years from then. But I am quite certain that our world will be a better, more resilient, and more beautiful place, and not least because it's a world that you all will be building. Thank you.
Remind me what happens now.
So I think this may be a moment for an anecdote, which is a continuation of one of your short points. Yes. Ben was the third laureate that I had the great opportunity to speak to over the phone. And I was very worried because his silence lasted approximately 52 minutes. 52, seemed like 52 minutes, 52 seconds. And then there was an extraordinary laughter after it that lasted about half that time. And I appreciated both. It was a wonderful moment. So the symbol of the Driehaus Prize is the Horrigic Monument to Lysikrates in English. And it is my greatest pleasure to bestow it upon you as its 2023 laureate. Congratulations, Ben. The very best to you.
Thank you.
You can lift it if you
I can hold it.
You can also lift it.